Me for an hour and a half as the person who was scheduled to speak, to moderate this panel, had a personal emergency and had to fly back to Los Angeles. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Matthew Karanian. His most recent book is Historic Armenia After 100 Years, which is available for sale. Matthew, where are you? Yes. Welcome.
I've published this book, Historic Armenia After 100 Years, and I want to tell everyone, I think maybe of all the speakers that you hear today, this might be the only book that was an accidental book. Not only was it an accident, but I never intended to actually go to Western Armenia. I got corralled into going there back in 1997, and I was just captivated by our homeland. I was captivated by, first of all, by the surprise that we had so much that was still there. I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut. All four of my grandparents are from Western Armenia. I've heard nothing but terrible stories about our homeland. I went to Western Armenia expecting to find nothing, expecting to find maybe some bones, maybe some shards. And what I found was back in 1997, we still had so much of our wealth still there. So many of our churches and monuments throughout Van, in Ani. And the region just captivated me, and it transformed my entire life. I've been traveling back there for several years. I've been back half a dozen times, as well as 2 years ago and last year. And it was finally 2 years ago when Hajik Marajan said to me, this would really be a subject for a good book. You've got to put this together. And it was a bit of an intimidating thought, but I followed through with it. And this accident got created and published just about 3 weeks ago. The reason I've published the book, ultimately, is to put an end to this century of silence that we have endured for the most part. And I don't mean the diaspora. The diaspora has been very vocal about its homeland. But our ancestors have been silent. They've been silenced, they've been traumatized, and it's time for us to move beyond that. And one way for us to move beyond that is by going back to our homeland and seeing what we have and celebrating what we have. And that's what I aim to accomplish with my book, is to encourage us to celebrate and not to mourn any longer. I've dedicated this book to my two grandmothers. My two grandmothers are both survivors. They both were in Western Armenia in the summer of 1915. They were both deported. They were both thrown out of their homes and allowed to take whatever they could take, end up wherever they could end up. And where did they end up? They ended up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and Hartford, Connecticut. That's where they ended up. And they started life all over again here. And so I dedicate the book to them and to the countless other women and men who survived and who rebuilt our nation. And so my book is very much a celebration, and in some ways it's also an accidental celebration. I thank you for sharing it with me.
On that note, on the note of survival and celebration, I'd like to invite Scout Tufankjian to speak about her book.
Hello. So it's always a little weird to talk about a photography book. I can't read from it, but I'll tell you a little bit about the story of how this came to be. I am half Armenian. I grew up in Massachusetts outside of the main Armenian community. And when you're half any culture that is as intense as ours is, you spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be Armenian. And so every time I stayed with my grandparents, I would go through their magazines and I would look for pictures of Argentinian Armenian soccer players or Australian American singers or, Syrian Armenian artists and try and find some of myself in them. And I would go to bookstores and I would look for movies, and the problem was that all I could find were stories about the genocide. And genocide stories are enormously important. They are, it is the trauma that has kind of seeped into our lives, but we're more than just the genocide. The Armenian story did not end in 1915. And so I decided to go out and seek all these Armenian communities and create this book that I'd wanted to see as a kid. And so for the past 6 years, I have been to 22 different countries, or 23, depending on how you count, and I have photographed Armenian communities in Syria, Argentina, Uruguay, Hong Kong, Australia, Syria, Lebanon, Ethiopia, India, all over the world, and it's been amazing because the Armenian community is so intense and so diverse, and there's this thread that ties us all together. There's a thread that ties a little kid growing up in a refugee camp in Beirut to a woman musician in Paris. It's just this amazing community, and so this is the book I've created, and the most amazing thing about this book is it was created with the community. This project was partially funded, as many of you know, by a Kickstarter campaign. And even people who, for people who didn't know about the Kickstarter campaign and didn't give to the Kickstarter campaign, all of you have helped make this book happen. This book has interviews with hundreds of different Armenians. It is, people all over the world have helped to make this happen. Thank you so much. Oh, and I'll be coming around. The book is not yet out. It comes out in April 14th. So I'll be coming around to the different tables and showing you the book because, as I said, we're to talk about a photography book. Thank you.
In fact, we have photos from the book being exhibited here. One of the things we wanted to do, in the midst of all this talk about genocide, mass violence, and murder, was to make sure that when we come outside, when we get out of the halls, we actually have photographs of survival, revival, and rebuilding. So these photos that you see around us, they're also exhibited in the hall outside. The proceeds are going to benefit the conference, so please, these are for sale, so consider purchasing them. I'd like to introduce next Alin Hovannisian, the author of Orhan's Inheritance, published by Algonquin, an amazing first book. Alin.
Parigesor, Shad ուրախ եմ հոսքդ նվելուս. I'm so happy to be here with you today. As a novelist, I try never to think about my audience when I'm writing creatively, but sometimes when thoughts of my audience sneaks into my consciousness, I never think of a group. I think of a single solitary individual. Because reading in general, but especially reading a novel, is a private, intimate, very solitary affair. If you think about it, the space between an open book and a person's heart is only about 7 inches. It's a very, very short distance, but a lot can happen in those 7 inches. Ask any book lover. Tears are shed in those 7 inches. The heart expands in those 7 inches. And when a book is really, really good, transformation occurs. Not just for the characters, but for the reader herself. When I sat down to write my first novel, the person I wanted to transform the most was nothing like me. He didn't resemble me ethnically, politically, or in terms of gender. To my initial surprise, he was male, he was politically apathetic, and he was Turkish. That is how the main character of my novel, Orhan Turkoğlu, was born. Orhan is an average, decent, politically apathetic human being. He's not a nationalist, he's not a zealot, his grandparents were not gendarmes. So why should he care what happened 100 years ago? That's the question I set out to answer in my first novel. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read only one page, the first page of the novel. I'll just set it up a little bit. Orhan goes back to his village for his grandfather's funeral, where he finds out that his grandfather has left the family home to a complete stranger in Los Angeles named Seda Melkonian. They found him inside one of 17 cauldrons in the courtyard, steeping in an indigo dye 2 shades darker than the summer sky. His arms and chin were propped over the copper edge, but the rest of Kemal Turkoğlu, age 93, had turned a pretty pale blue. Orhan was told the old men of the village stood in front of the soaking corpse, fingering their worry beads while their sons waited, holding dice from abandoned backgammon games. Modesty forbade any female spectators, but within hours the news spread from one kitchen and vendor stall to the next. Orhan's grandfather, his dede, had immersed his body, naked except for his breeches, into a vat of fabric dye outside their family home. Orhan sinks into the back seat of the private car, a luxury he talked himself into when the dread of a 7-hour bus ride back to the village started to overwhelm his grief. He wanted to mourn in private, away from the chickens, the elderly, the traveling merchants, or worse yet, the old acquaintance that could normally be found on a bus ride to the interior of Turkey. He told himself he could afford a little luxury now, but the car showed up an hour late, sporting a broken air conditioner and a driver reeking of cheap cologne and sweat. Orhan lights a cigarette and shuts his eyes against the sting of the man's body odor. "Going to visit your family?" the driver asks. "Yes," Orhan answers. "That's nice. So many people leave their villages and never come back," he says. The truth is, it's been 3 years since his last visit. Had Dede moved out of the God-forsaken place, there would be no reason to go back. The car veers off the highway, making its way along a recently paved road toward the city of Sivas, on whose outskirts Garod village is located. The driver slows down and opens a window, letting the terroir-laden scent of soil waft into the car's cavity. Unlike Istanbul, whose majesty is reflected in the Bosphorus, Central Anatolia is the quintessential other Turkey, in which illusions of majesty and grandeur are harder to come by. Here, shepherds follow the bleating of long-haired goats, and squat village women carry bundles of kindling on their backs. Time and progress are long-lost relatives who send an occasional letter. Thank you.
It is amazing the number of books on the Armenian genocide, whether fiction or non-fiction, that have appeared over the past couple of months and will be appearing over the next couple of months, both from major trade publishing houses and academic press. So among those books is Like Water on Stone by Dana Walrath, and I'd like to invite Dana to say a few words about her book.
It's such a pleasure to be here and to introduce Like Water on Stone to all of you. Like Scout, I'm Geshai. I grew up in the 1960s, before the Civil Rights Movement, to an Armenian mother and an American father. So I didn't go to Armenian church. I didn't have an Armenian last name. I didn't look Armenian, but still we ate lahmacun, dolma, pilaf, tanabur, everything every night at the dinner table, and we listened to George Mugardichian playing the oud on the Now Sounds of the Middle East and all those good things. And I was searching my whole life to try and make sense of this. I remember at the Armenian Club in Columbia University saying, we need to link the genocide to what's going on in Cambodia. And people being not too comfortable with that, because I think in the early 1980s, the late 70s, we were still so injured as a people. It wasn't time yet for us to be able to see how our tragedy is really fundamentally part of all global social justice issues and human rights issues. So now here we are, 100 years strong, celebrating our survival, our culture, all that we've accomplished. And we can tell our story so that other people can then use it to heal from their own stories. When I wrote this, I wrote it very specifically in verse, free verse, for young people. It's technically a young adult novel, though I've even had gatekeepers saying that maybe it belongs over in the adult side more than the young adult side because it deals very honestly and truthfully with the genocide. I was working with refugees in Burlington, Vermont at the time. I'm also an anthropologist, and my job at the College of Medicine of University of Vermont was to teach medical students about how to deliver cross-cultural care. And we were going in and working with refugee communities, and I was thinking about what was it like to come from Burundi or the Congo or Rwanda and land in an American high school, and how good it would be able to read something that resonated with your life experience, but that also had a lot of white space around it. So instead of very densely packed prose, It's written in free verse with a lot of room to breathe. And it's told in first-person narratives. There are three main characters, three siblings, and they're modeled loosely, very, very loosely, after one sentence that I had from my grandmother's life. When I was a little girl, I asked my mother about her, and she said, well, after her parents were killed, she and her younger brother, Uncle Benny and Aunt Alice, they hid during the day and ran at night till they got from Palu to the orphanage in Aleppo. And I kind of walked around with that, not knowing how to make sense of it, until I was able to put it into this book. But as I was writing, I knew I needed something to make it so it was safe for readers, safe for me as I wrote, safe for the young ones as they traveled. So a magical creature came in, Ardziv, so it's historical fiction meets magical realism, meets poetry and prose. So I like living on the margins. That's what happens when you grow up biculturally. You live in those in-between spaces. So the magical being Ardziv is a narrator. He's a guardian spirit who watches over them, because if I believe in one thing, it's the power of the imagination to get us through things. I mean, we need the facts. I'm so indebted to historians who've documented all those facts, and I use them constantly as I researched. But in the end, it's our imaginations that help us survive. It's our imaginations that let us take facts and turn it into knowledge and into ways of understanding the world. So thank you. I hope you will read this.
Next, I'd like to invite Nancy Krikorian. Her most recent book, All the Light There Was, and she also has two other books. Again, they deal with the genocide and the aftermath. Nancy.
Hi, I want to say it's just so exciting for me to be here with all of you at this event, and also sitting at this table with all these fabulous writers and activists and friends. So I've written 3 novels so far, and I'm working on my 4th one. I'm mostly going to talk about the 3rd one, but I just want to give you the little story of how I got there. So the first novel, Zabel, was a fictionalized account of my grandmother's life as an Armenian genocide survivor and immigrant bride, and it was hugely popular in the Armenian community, and I want to thank everyone who bought it and read it. My second book, Dreams of Bread and Fire, is about a half Armenian girl who hops a freight train, has sex, and has a boyfriend who sets off a bomb outside a Turkish Airlines office. It was not popular at all. And I wish that I had called it The Bad Armenian Girl, because I think it would have sold more copies. My third novel is called All the Light There Was, and it's about a young girl coming of age in Paris in the Armenian community during the Nazi occupation. And I just got really interested in this whole idea of all these Armenians who had survived the genocide and gone to France and rebuilt their lives, and there they are in Belleville in Paris. They're tailors, they're shoemakers, and they look out the window and the German army is marching down the Rue de Belleville. So that's what this one is about. And when I told my editor my next book is going to be about Armenians in Beirut during the Lebanese Civil War, she said, oh, it's the Armenian Diaspora Quartet. So that's actually what I'm calling it now. And the other thing I was going to say, if anybody here, the way that I work is I do a ton of research, like massive research. I read memoirs, I read letters, I read histories, and my favorite part is I actually interview people. So for Zabel, I interviewed my grandmother and some of her friends who were genocide survivors. For Dreams of Bread and Fire, I made good friends with Monty Melkonian's family and interviewed them, and I did a lot of research. This one, I went to Paris and interviewed 80 and 90-year-old Armenians who had been in Paris during the war, some of them in the resistance, one of them had been in the German army, believe it, an Armenian in the German army, and so I met all these different people. So right now I'm in the research and development phase of the book on Armenians in Beirut during the Lebanese Civil War, and if anybody here has any stories they want to tell me, look for me afterwards. Oh, and my friend Sarah Lee Whitson says, I'm using 30 seconds. I'm part of Armenian Project 2015, Sarah Lee and some of the other people here. We're organizing a mass fly-in of Armenians to Istanbul for April 24th, 2015. And if anybody wants to go with us, talk to us.
Next, I'd like to invite Chris Bohjalian, who's I don't think it's not even the most recent novel now. There's been 2 new novels following the Sandcastle Girls, and then a 3rd one on the way. but the book continues to be on the attention internationally as well. More than 20 countries, languages, it's been translated to over the past several months. Chris?
It is a pleasure, it is an honor, it is a privilege to be here at Responsibility 2015. Hachik, thank you for that absolutely lovely introduction. And it is a particular honor to be seated at this remarkable table with all of my esteemed peers. Scout, you know how much I love every single picture in your book. Aline, your first novel is a bravura performance. Nancy, I've been reading your books going all the way back to Zabel. Matthew, your book on historic Armenia, the photographs are a great gift to this community. The context you put them in with your words is astonishing. Eric, I can't wait for Project Nemesis. If anyone is going to bring this to life for the world outside of this room, it is you. And Dana, my compatriot, Dana is not simply an immensely gifted writer and storyteller in her magnificent young adult novel in verse. She's a fellow High Tide warrior with me in the Vermont legislature, fighting the fight against denial even in the Green Mountains. So Dana, thank you. I'm a novelist, which means that I am inherently a narcissist, and under normal circumstances will speak about my books for hours. I am shameless, and I am not shy. But I wanted to take these few moments to talk about Responsibility 2015 and the monumental work of the ARF, the monumental work of all of the scholars, the historians, the activists, the artists who are here this weekend, and of course, to give thanks to the Armenian National Committee of America, of Canada, of Australia, for the work that you do day in and day out. The Sandcastle Girls was published 2.5 years ago. And so what I thought I would speak about today, since I imagine everyone in this room has either read the book or is familiar with the book, is talk about the reaction to the book in the last 2.5 years, particularly among the denialist community. The reality is that I didn't write the novel for all of us in this room. We know the stories. Our parents, our grandparents, our great-parents endured those stories. I wrote the Sandcastle Girls for readers in Indianapolis, in Jacksonville, and Portland who could not find Aleppo on a map. And what I have found in the last 2.5 years is this. Even now, a day doesn't go by where I don't get 2 or 3 or even 4 messages or posts on Facebook from readers saying one of 2 things. They are either saying, A, I just read the Sandcastle Girls and I am so pissed off at my high school teachers. Why did no one teach me the story of the Armenian Genocide? Or they are saying, B, my book group read the Sandcastle Girls last night, and I'm really embarrassed to say that we are 11 really smart women, and most of us knew almost nothing about the Armenian Genocide. Since the book has been published, I've had the opportunity to explain to all of these people that there's one very good reason for these reactions, and it's not the G word, it's the D word, it's denial. I had an op-ed in the Boston Globe last Monday about that very issue, Turkish denial, and specifically Erdogan and the Turkish government's despicable, appalling, blunt attempt to overshadow the Armenian Genocide commemoration on April 24th by bringing up Gallipoli. It is so blunt, it's not even Machiavellian. It is merely despicable. And in the 6 days since that op-ed has run, I've had 2 reactions. I've had a number of reactions from the ODR community saying, you have every right to be pissed off. This is appalling. And I've heard from hundreds of people on Twitter, on Facebook, and on email saying, never happened. Check your facts, including one of the most interesting Twitter followers I have, Armenia Fact Check, which reports apparently that there was no Armenian genocide if I were only to have checked my facts. That is why events like today matter. That is why the work of Geoffrey Robertson matters. That is why the work of the ANCA, the ANCC, the Armenian National Committee of Australia, and ARF matters. That is why the work of our scholars, our lawyers, matters. Writers talk with an agonizing amount of hubris about finding our voice. The fact is, I started writing in the Mesozoic era. I found my voice 14 books ago. But here's the thing about the Sandcastle Girls. It is only in the last 3 years, thanks to all of you, that I have found my heart. Thank you very much.
Tomorrow is March 15. Many decades ago, on March 15, on the street in Berlin, Solomon Tehlirian approached Talat Pasha, the mastermind of the Armenian Genocide, and assassinated him. Today, so many decades after that, Operation Nemesis is finally and gradually receiving the attention it deserves. This is through several books that are coming out this year and another book project for next year. And I'm happy to say that we have 2 authors here who are going to speak about their books that tackle head-on Operation Nemesis. Marian.
It's a privilege and an honor to be here today with you all to celebrate Responsibility 2015. I come with a bit of a pedigree. My grandfather was one of the first ARF members in the United States. He was also general manager of the Heidenik, and my grandmother was a founding member of the ARS in the United States as well. I am the daughter, or the granddaughter, of 4 grandparents who were survivors of the massacres in the Hovannisian massacres and in Adana. One set were really truly victims. They were victimized totally by it, and it changed them completely. The other side were resistors, and in the process, I got to hear a lot of stories from my grandmother. My grandmother was one of those women that insisted on working with the men. She loaded rifles at Georgial, for example, and she was very proud of it. And she's told stories about this for all of my life. This is what I remember. I remember men yelling in the night, playing tavlu and yelling about Armenian politics. I remember it fired up by Turkish coffee, which my grandmother would fill constantly. So I lived with my grandparents till I was 6 years old, and I heard all these stories. But one story I did not hear was Nemesis. And we didn't know anything about this until my grandfather died, and in 1990, my mother and I went through their house, and we discovered a cache of letters upstairs in the little study that I used to sleep in when I was a child. These letters were from Solomon Tehlirian, from Aben Garo, from Shahin Natali, and from my grandfather, talking about Nemesis. Many of them were about that exact assassination. And I'm going to read you a little bit in a minute. So my mother grabbed these, knowing what they were. She guessed very quickly, took them to her house. She cataloged them, she summarized them, she put them in a box and put them in your damp basement. They were flooded twice. I swear it's because for her they were kind of radioactive. She couldn't imagine knowing what to do with them. And I knew this would be in my inheritance, something that I was going to have to deal with. My own work in writing, I teach writing now at Hampshire College. I was working for 23 years as chair of the department at Ithaca College, where I was professor of writing there. So my work had been in writing and trauma, how writing can mediate the effects of trauma. So I already came with a certain amount of information about how trauma is voiced, how it's not voiced, and how voicing is better than not voicing. So I'm looking at these letters, and I'm listening to Aben Garo bleeding for his people, because he was also the ambassador from Armenia at the time. So the letters also concerned not only what was going on with Nemesis, but also how desperate the plight of the Armenians was by then, by 1920. By the end of 1920, they could see that the Republic was going to die, at least the independence of the Republic was going to die. So they were in a terrible situation. They were abandoned by the West, they were hunted by the Turks, and attacked by the Russians. Some of the letters actually addressed this tragic information about what was happening in the Republic as well. I do want to talk to you, though, about one letter in particular. It's one that I think you might like to hear, because it speaks to a certain kind of joy. It's a strange sort of joy. It's a joy in justice and the need for justice. We've been hearing about it a lot today. So this is a letter that was written on June 6th, sorry. It's from Vahang Zakarians. Talian did not do this by himself. He had a whole cadre of people who helped him. They were there in Berlin with him, and some of them were abroad, collecting money, sending the money to him, and also giving him advice for how to do all this, and setting him up to be able to. So this letter was written on the day that the jury acquitted him. When the jury returned after an hour and a quarter of deliberations, the foreman read their decision. You can imagine what a feverish and wound-up situation we were all awaiting. The whole courtroom had become silent. No sound could be heard from there. Everyone had their ears sharpened, and they were waiting impatiently. Several hundred eyes were directed to the foreman of the jury, and to the written paper in his hand, all hearts were fluttering, ours in one manner, the Turks in another. Everyone was feeling the weight and greatness of that moment. Everyone was tense, but at the same time they had the feeling that finally everything is decided, and their tensed nerves would relax. Fortunately, the silent tension lasted 2 moments. Otherwise, if it had lasted 2 hours, we'd all have been destroyed. He began to read. Everyone is listening. Everyone is borrowing 10 ears to listen with and sharpening their listening second by second, becoming more attentive, training both eyes and ears, or sprouting on your entire body. The tension has reached the highest degree when that moment arrives, when to the question put by the presiding officer of the court, a yes or no answer, and he is or is not guilty. The foreman, very definitive and loud in tones, 9. Immediately the courtroom explodes in applause and silence. I translate that. Soderman quietly asks, "What are they saying? What does it mean?" "That means you are free," I answer. After all this, the president of the court building on the 9 of the jury announces the court's decision that Soderman is acquitted and released, that he is lifting the arrest order from that moment on, and the court expenses will be assumed by the state treasury. One unimaginable happiness and a very long applause from everywhere within the limit of the full courtroom. Everyone exploded. Armenian, German, woman, and girl, like a torrent, are running toward the cage where Soderman is crying. Joy, hugging each other, emoting. Some people are kissing his hand, some his forehead. Former landlady is crying. You think that she was his mother. Finally, the police send the people out of the courtroom. I go with Soderman to the jail so that we can get out together. Down below, I kissed his forehead on your behalf and went outside because they wouldn't allow me to go out that door with him. At the door of the jail, people have gathered, more than 200. There are many women with bouquets of flowers. The weather is oppressive and the sun is burning, but no matter. They have been waiting 2.5 hours for him to come out. The photographers are waiting, but of course I intervened and said there is no need for pictures to avoid publicity. Finally he came out, and from the other door. Without being photographed, he left by car. We brought him, and without meeting with too many people, first to avoid publicity, and second from the perspective of caution, and finally today, we sent him off on his way. Dear Shahan, you can imagine the extent of my joy. Thank you.
I'd like to now invite Eric Bogosian to speak about his book on Operation Nemesis. Eric?
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here today. I'm honored to be here, and thank you, Khachik, and thank you to a number of people here in the room who helped make this book happen. I don't have a book to sell here today because it isn't coming out till April 21st, but I'll show you the cover. There it is. So, but I have book plates, and I will autograph them, and anybody wants to order one through Amazon ahead of time, that helps with the number and gets it out there. I don't know what you guys know of me or don't know of me, but I'm primarily known, I guess, as an actor. 60 episodes of Law and Order, you know me from that, or Under Siege 2 or whatever, but those are like to the bottom of my acting resume. But I am also an author, and I've written a number of plays, and I've written a few novels, and this project began for me because I had heard the story of Soghomon Tehlirian. I'd heard, but not the story of Nemesis. This story of a young Armenian killing Talat Pasha in Berlin in 1921 was sort of existing in the culture as almost an urban legend. It would get repeated, it would show up every now and then, and I had been asked over the years why I didn't write something about Armenian experience, about the Armenian genocide. And as this became clear in my mind that this was actually a true story, that an Armenian had done this, I thought this would make a good feature film. It would be I would be able to finally tell the story of the Armenian genocide in a way that for me was artistically satisfying. Nancy mentions Nemesis in her book, in Bread and Fire, but it had also been mentioned very briefly by Samantha Power in A Problem from Hell, and Peter Balakian had also mentioned in Black Dog of Fate. But it was sort of glancing. It was like, who are these? I was focusing on Soghomon. And when I did, the story seemed to just write itself. I mean, here's a man who survived a deportation caravan, saw his whole family murdered before his eyes, survived, escapes, ends up in Berlin years later, has Talat Pasha pass him on the street. His mother comes to him in a dream and says, how can you let this man live? He gets a hold of a pistol, he shoots him, he kills him, he's arrested, there's a trial, and he's acquitted at the trial, as Marion just explained. I got the trial transcript, I read it, and I thought, okay, I can write this as a movie. It breaks out as a movie very easily. The first act is the deportation caravan, which would allow me to show people exactly what horrors our families went through. And the second act could be in Berlin and have him come across Talat and then decide to kill him and kill him. And the third act would be the trial. I mean, perfect, right? Everybody can understand. It ends with the acquittal, end of movie. The only problem was as I began my research, I discovered that, in fact, this story is not the true story. And this may become as a surprise to some people in this room because, in fact, there are two stories of Tetlerian, and there is the Operation Nemesis story. I learned the true story because Jacques Desrosiers wrote a very dense book on the topic in the mid-'80s. He was allowed to go into the ARF archives, and he got some information there. And that book explains that Operation Nemesis was a transnational, transcontinental conspiracy composed of many men, many assassins, and that they successfully exterminated pretty much the entire top Turkish leadership after World War I. And for some reason, no one knows this story. When Armenian genocide gets brought up all the time, somehow this very important historical piece of information is left out. Why is it important historically? Because not only is it, I've never heard of anything like this in history, where a group of basically civilians, no, it has nothing to do with Munich, that movie by Steven Spielberg, because these are not Mossad agents. They are not supported by a powerful state. These are small businessmen, like Marion's grandfather, and other men who decide amongst themselves that this has to happen with the support of the Republic of Armenia, ARF, and they put this together in 1921 at a time when there are not telephones. They're communicating by telegraph. They recruit a number of men, including Tetlerian, who is a ex-soldier and in fact was not on a deportation caravan at all. He was fighting in the volunteer side, the Armenian volunteers in the Russian front during the war, and as well as other very important Fedayeen like Arshavir Sharegian and others. And together these men knock off Talat Pasha, Jamal Pasha, Saeed Halim Pasha, Dr. Shakir, who was the main guy who ran the special organization, which did most of the dirty work, and others, including spies and other people. How this story could be left unknown, other than the work by Desrosiers, was a mystery to me. And I felt I had to write about it, but now I was outside the realm of the simplicity of a screenplay. So, not knowing any better, I dove into, 6 years ago, writing this book, which is a fully researched book on Operation Nemesis, and it will come out next month. It is by accident that it's coming out the week of our the 100th year after the April 24th, 1915. It was a lot of work. I thank the people, some of whom are in this room, Sarah Lee, Marion, Mark, Raymond Kevorkian, who helped me or allowed me to interview them and try and dig around. This is not going to be the last word on this conspiracy, because it's almost impossible to dig down and get all the information. I'm also not a historian, I'm not a scholar, but I did read everything I could possibly read. I did interview everybody I could interview. I went to Glendale and I hung out with Silva, and I did it all. So for those of you who know anything about Operation Nemesis, that's Silva Manoogian, who is the daughter of Shahan Notley, another important member of the group. So at any rate, I don't know why I'm summing this all up here right now. I wanted to actually tell you why I did this, because I'm sitting in the next room, I'm watching on the other floor, and I'm listening to everybody speaking, and I'm thinking, well, what am I doing here? I mean, this has never been my thing to tell people about the Armenian Genocide. But I realized that it was sort of, it had to happen, that's all. I was at the right place at the right time. I was the person who could write this book and bring attention to it. And I had nothing to lose. I'm at a point in my career where they can't hurt me. My children are old enough where nobody can call me up and say things and scare me. And I just thought my name recognition and so forth can make this happen. I believe this book, and I can say this in this room. I won't be saying this during my interviews as I promote the book next month, but I believe this book is a Trojan horse. The story of Nemesis is incredible, and it must be told, and I'm trying to tell it the best I can. But I believe that I am delivering the story of the Armenian Genocide within this book, and the chapter on the genocide is intense, and I guarantee you that. Of course, it would have to be. But the book galleys have started to go out, and as Chris said, it is unbelievable what people don't know about the Armenian Genocide. I travel with a pretty smart-ass group of people who think they know everything, and as they read the galleys, they are blown away. I never heard of this. I never knew this. What is this? And it's exactly what we're being talked about in the next row, during the talks. This is not a debate between two sides, and yet that's the way it's being presented to the world at large, and I actually didn't know. So I could say this book is for non-Armenians, but I believe it's for Armenians too, particularly Armenians of my generation and younger, who have only a vague idea of what happened. I learned so much putting this book together, I can't tell you. I finally reached a point where I was just breathless with how horrible it was. And I don't know that I reached the level that the task provided for me, but I did the best I could. And so I hope you, of course, get a chance to look at it, and Marion's book, because Marion's book is got very, very important information in it, and that was not her writing what she just read. That's one of the letters, and you read that and it knocks you out reading what these men were doing. These men were just little guys who made this decision to do this incredible, remarkable, brave action. And this is my memorial to my grandfather. I see Kachik is getting restless there, so I will. I'm ready to wrap it up. I don't know what my last word is here because I've lost my train of thought. But at any rate, thank you.
Their book has already appeared in France and Turkey in Turkish, Turkey and the Armenian Ghost on the Trail of the Genocide. Laure.
Guillaume and I are really honored to be with you today. Our book has just been translated into English and published by McGill University Press, so we are really proud of it. And we are really excited that more readers learn about Turkey's attitude toward genocide today. So just to say a few words about us, Guillaume and I are journalists. We've been correspondents in Turkey for almost 10 years for Le Monde and Le Figaro French dailies, and we've just settled back in Paris. And 10 years ago, as French, we had specific interest for the Armenian genocide, but we must confess that we didn't know that much, and none of us have Armenian origins. And so usually the first questions we are asked by Armenians is, so why did you write a book about Armenian genocide? So the answer is quite simple. It's just because we are journalists. 10 years ago, we mainly chose Turkey as a destination, professional destination, because it has just started its EU negotiations. So as journalists, this political process was really interesting. But then once in Turkey, where the Armenian question erupted in the public sphere, so we understood the genocide which took place 100 years ago was of high importance for Turkey today. That Turkey could not become a democracy without facing its past and its responsibility. So during several years, we documented the consequences of the denial in Turkey today. So we went on the trail of the genocide. So in our book, we concretely explain the political evolution in Turkey towards the genocide and also the evolution of the Turkish society, which was made possible because these last 10 years, genocide taboo cracked. So, and we also had the privilege to meet Randing and talk about that with him before he was assassinated. So as journalists, we traveled to Anatolia many times and investigated there. We visited territories of historic Armenia. There we found some hidden Armenians, some elderly survivors who told their story, their pain, their fear, but also their hope. And we searched for stones, graveyards that tell the Armenian prisons, despite efforts of Turkish republics to destroy them. We listened to oral stories of Kurdish, of Turkish, Alevite people who do say what happened 100 years ago. And we found some amazing stories which remain untold for 100 years. For instance, we met the family who used to be the owner of the Chankaya Palace, which used to be the presidential palace till last year, till President Erdogan moved to this Ottoman palace. And also we dug out stories of Turkish people who saved some Armenians during the genocide. So our book, you understood, is not about history. It's a journalistic book. It's a picture of modern Turkey from a genocide perspective. And as a conclusion, we've reached the conclusion that Turkey is haunted by the Armenian ghost. As the victims, the descendants of the perpetrators are also obsessed by what occurred, and they are also prisoners of the state denial. So thank you very much, and I'm really sorry for my poor English.
I would like to invite Professor Richard Hovannisian to deliver some remarks about his work.
Thank you very much. I wish I could be humorous and witty. I'm not capable of doing that. I do want to make 3 short points. One of them, one of our important writers has written a book, Chonar Herosner, Humble Heroes. I'm fortunate, I'm old enough to have remembered Solomon Tehlirian as a person, and indeed a very humble individual, unassuming. You would never think that he could hurt a fly, and yet he was driven by the need to avenge his people. And Marian, I have to say that your grandparents were also Chonar Herosner, the Sachakian family of Syracuse. Your grandmother actually was something that we sort of pride ourselves on, that we're able to move very freely in both an Armenian and non-Armenian world. And she was one of those pioneers who was able, Eliza Sachakian was able to do that. I don't have any book to pitch. Well, I do have. I've done in the last years something that's not at all aggrandizing, satisfying. Well, it's satisfying, and that is that I've sat down and edited other people's very poor writing And I've done that for a purpose, and that is that I wanted to keep alive our historic Armenian provinces in the Ottoman Empire. And so I started conferences at UCLA in 1997 and did one or two a year. And then for the last several years have been editing each of those, the proceedings of each of those, and have come out now with 13 volumes, and I have one more to go on Husadar and Kesab. Most fortunately, I'm sort of like a petty merchant because I schlepp these books around the world to get rid of them, and I'm happy to say that most of them are now out of print. I do have 3 titles here, one each. If anyone is interested, you may have it. But the second thing I want to pitch is actually my grandson, Garin Hovannisian. Garin did this book, Family of Shadows. And for those of you particularly who were raised in the United States, it's our story. It's not my story, it's our story. It's a story of, first of all, a parent generation going through the genocide. Kaspar, my father, by the age of people graduating from high school in America, had been through a genocide, had been taken away by Kurdish tribesmen from the death caravans where his entire family went, never to be seen again. He was taken away by to work as a slave for Kurdish tribesmen, ran away to join Antranik's army in Erzurum, retreated to the Caucasus, got caught up in the Russian Civil War between the Reds and the Whites, and somehow ended up at the port of Providence and the Chelsea shoe factories before coming out to California to start a new family. And my generation is the second generation here, is that we knew about what happened. We didn't reject what happened, but we really didn't live what our parents lived, and sometimes we even wanted to deny because we wanted to be Americans, we wanted to be white, and we were embarrassed of our parents' accents or where they dressed, the way they walked. And so that was until we came to our senses and understood something, and the third generation, my own son's generation, who picked up the cause between the generations and felt proud in what they were able to do. And part of that, I think, is what I said about Elise Sachaklian, was you're able to handle more than one world at a time and integrate them. And it's very important to be able to integrate these, to feel very, very confident in who you are, and to do anything as good as anyone who can speak only one language. And that's the story. I have 5 copies for anyone who may be interested, and I have one of these, each of the other ones. In any case, I want to congratulate you for having been so patient, this long luncheon, and the organizers of this event. Hachoguchu.
I now would like to invite Geoffrey Robertson to deliver his remarks.
I'm actually an Australian. Private Eye, the satirical magazine, calls me an Australian who's had a bowel transplant. When I first came to London, along with Bill Clinton as a Rhodes Scholar, I was still had those irritable Australian vowels of France and branch, the nasal vowels that define my race. But when I went to the British Bar and made my first appearance at the Old Bailey, terrifying appearance because it was before the most frightening right conservative judge, and I was appealing for a man who was wearing or charged with wearing an indecent T-shirt. And it fell to me to explain to this terrifying judge what the logo was that was allegedly indecent. And I said, my lord, it is a logo, it reads, fuck art, let's dance. And there was a terrifying silence. He said, fuck art, let's what, Mr. Robertson? I said, dance, my lord, dance. Oh, you're an Australian. What you have to learn to say if you want to succeed at the British Bar is fuck art, let's dance. So my vowels changed in the course of my career. And in that career, I had served as the president of the United Nations War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone, and which indicted Charles Taylor, and I'd been a judge in Britain. And I had written books and taught on international law, and particularly the law on genocide. And when a few years ago, the Armenian National Committee came to me for an opinion. I was a Queen's Counsel, and as a Queen's Counsel we have an ethic that we don't give the opinion that the client wants, we give the opinion that in our view is correct. That is an utter ethic of your Queen's Counsel. If you want an opinion that is convenient, if you want an opinion that suits you, you go to an American lawyer or to a solicitor. But and so the ANC committee came to me and said, we're worried about the British response to questions about recognizing the Armenian genocide, which was the evidence is not sufficiently unequivocal. That was a strange phrase cooked up by the mandarins in the Foreign Office to avoid insulting or embarrassing Turkey. But that was a risk, because my opinion could very well have been, if I found the evidence to be such, that there was not an Armenian genocide. So the first thing I did was to conduct a Freedom of Information search in the British Foreign Office. And there I found this fascinating document that explained to ministers why they were using this cover-up phrase, not sufficiently unequivocal. The document said, a memorandum said, Turkey is neuralgic on this subject. Neuralgic is a good and precise word, I think, for the Turkish attitude. Our position is not ethical. However, given Turkey's importance, commercial, political, and strategic, we have no other option. So that explained the British genocide equivocation on the subject, and you have exactly the same in America with Barack Obama refusing to use the G word that he used when he was running for presidency in 2008. He now uses Medsjürgen as his phrase, and he says, if you want to find out my real opinion, you'll have to Google it, what I said in 2008. So we are faced initially with this genocide equivocation to avoid the strategic importance of Turkey. But when I looked at the evidence, I came as a judge to the conclusion that beyond reasonable doubt, as a matter of law, this genocide, as it is defined in the 1948 Convention, took place. And I use the Convention, I use the learning on the Convention, the case law that has been developed by the International Criminal Court and the courts that have declared Srebrenica, the killing of only 7,000 men and boys, to be genocide, and I apply it in this book. Now, that makes this book very boring. I'm afraid chapter 4 is one of the most boring chapters ever written on the subject. But it is nonetheless, that's the chapter where I apply the law to the facts that I develop earlier in chapters 2 and 3. And those facts are terrifying, they're stomach-turning, and these are facts that have been agreed by all those genocide deniers, the paid historians, who don't know the first thing about genocide law because they're not lawyers. They're like President Erdogan, who says, oh, there couldn't have been a genocide because there are still Armenians alive in Turkey. that is the kind of ignorance that pervades a lot of the genocide-denying historians. And in the first chapter, I do philosophize about this odd thing that as an Australian, I had a granduncle killed. He was there in the boats on the 24th. The night was the landing that was used as the excuse for rounding up the intellectuals in Constantinople. And he was shot pretty quickly by a Turkish sniper. And I ask what special mourning is due to him. A century on, I don't think there is any special mourning. He volunteered to fight. He was lawfully killed by a Turk who was defending his homeland. But for the Armenians who were massacred and who were deported, and there is absolutely no doubt, we've got the laws, the deportation laws, we've got the abandoned property laws. For them, they were the victims of an international crime. And that does require, 100 years on, 200 years on, it requires remembrance, it requires reparation. And later in the book, I turn to what can be done now, 100 years on, for those reparations to attain the retribution that is necessary if the world is to become the better place that Raphael Lemkin, who devised the law of genocide, decided. And you know what? The reason why we have a law on genocide, it is Sogomon Tenderian, because as a young law student in Poland, Raphael Lemkin, this brilliant Jewish professor later, became obsessed with Sogomon's case. He couldn't understand how, with all the justice that attended the assassination of Talat, how the world could continue with racial and religious massacres that would get vigilante justice. He said there must be a better way, and he devoted his life to books showing that the tinderbox of race, the tinderbox of religion, requires special protections for racial and religious minorities. And he looked at the British to do them justice. It took the 68 of the perpetrators to Malta to try to put them on trial. And they realized there was no international criminal law. They had to release them eventually when Ataturk took some hostages. They released them because there was no law against mass murdering your own people if that was the directive of the state. There was no international criminal law until Nuremberg, and there was no law against genocide until Lemkin's work, which was based throughout the 30s on the Armenian case, matured, and with the example of the Holocaust became the Genocide Convention. So that was an ironic but important consequence of Sogomon's work and Operation Nemesis's work. But the attempt by Turkey today to say it was war, it was military necessity that hundreds of thousands of women and children and old men were sent to places hundreds of miles away, which we've only heard of because ISIS now occupies them, sent without medicine, without food. That kind of military necessity of killing civilians in these numbers must be stopped, because there have been other occasions, Chinese in Indonesia, the Bengalis and Hindus in Bangladesh and so on. We could go on. Those now threatened by the Christians in Yazidi Christians and Coptic Christians threatened by ISIS. It wasn't military necessity that I disprove. I disprove a number of lies that you can find on the Turkish government website. because come April the 24th, there are a lot of nervous governments around the world, the governments of Britain, United States, Australia, who will wring their hands and say 1915 was a terrible tragedy. And the moment the word tragedy is uttered, you know it's a denial, because it wasn't a tragedy, ladies and gentlemen, it was a crime. It was a crime against humanity. It was the worst crime of all. It was genocide, and I hope my book proves it.
And thank you all for being here. Now our authors are going to be signing copies of their books only for 15 minutes, and then we'll move to the panels. Thank you very much.